Frank introduced Matt Barewicz and Kevin Stapleton. I'm going to have you reintroduce yourself just a little bit, about even a tidbit about your background, and then go ahead with this presentation. We're really encouraging you to focus the conversation, your questions and everything, and then the whole conversation today really focused on this segment of our economy, and really stay focused on this level of job. Other questions, absolutely bring them in, but we'll go from there. Thank you.
Good afternoon, all. I'm Mathew Barewicz, Economic and Labor Market Information Chief for the Vermont Department of Labor, and proud to present Kevin Stapleton, also an economist with our Labor Market Information Division. So for those who were here last time, we had a big conversation about data, kind of talking about the universe in which Kevin and I live, and we're going to continue that discussion. And we thought as one way to facilitate the discussion and be responsive to the questions we received last time, we are going to present kind of a recap of what we discussed last time via answering the questions that were asked of us that we couldn't answer during the last presentation. This will hopefully take us up through some of the discussion. But as a quick recap, our division is 100% federally funded. There's one of our little divisions in every state in the nation. Some of them are bigger than others, like California, for example, I think is like 80 strong. We're about 12. So we are quite small, we're quite lean, but that means we can be responsive. And part of our role and responsibility through the Employment and Training Administration, a division within the U.S. Department of Labor, is to be a quasi-research arm of this organization. So again, our purpose is here is kind of talk about the information we have, share some of our expertise about the data that exists, its strengths and weaknesses. All of you bring expertise to the table here, and we want to, shortcut your decision making, your experiences, and how this all plays out in terms of recommendations. We don't want you to become experts in data. That's our role, and we want to just kind of take you on a continued tour of our data. So we'll do a recap on the ground rules that I set last time, which Michelle's already done a great job of doing already. But recap through these questions that I talk about, and then we're going to talk about occupational data, which was really the charge we were given. Like, let's talk about the Vermont economy from an occupational standpoint, and talk about where we know jobs exist as they currently are in the state of Vermont, where they're projected to grow, and also the skill mix conversation, this concept of middle, which is something I use in quotations. It's not something that I have an official federal definition of what middle means, or high or low, and it's terms that I'm personally not too comfortable with, because there are certainly occupations that have different barriers to entry related to education or experience, and this concept can be a little simplified, but through these discussions we're going to hopefully learn about them and maybe even set a definition if that's something that is determined to be important for this group. So ground rules, please ask questions. And that's the point of this discussion, is this, while it does feel like a one-way street, I don't want it to be. I'd be happy to share the microphone with anyone who wants to stand and ask questions, and I will do my best to repeat the questions so that people on the phone or in the crowd can hear what those questions were. So this, we may, from those who were here last time, may remember my little simple Venn diagram related to labor or economic data and the flavors associated with it. And we spent a lot of our time last time really looking at people in Vermont, and the overlap between individuals and the household, and how the U.S. Census tracks a bunch of valuable information about individuals at the population level or the town level, and also a product that we have in partnership with the Bureau of Labor Statistics known as the Local Area Unemployment Statistics, the LAUS program, which allows us to understand who's working, what the demographic characteristics of the unemployed are, even understanding who's not in the labor force, and metrics of the like. So again, as a way to get everyone back to where we were when we last ended, there was a question. Let's say we showed some population data for the state of Vermont, and someone said, well, let's look at that, adding the U.S. population to that. And so this is a graph representing the blue lines being the U.S. and green being Vermont. It shows by age category where the growth or where the change in our population is expected to grow. This green data is actually stuff that we presented last time. So we talked about how Vermont has a lower birth rate, and we've had a lower birth rate for a while. And so we see the aging of the population indicating, right there, that we're making fewer Vermonters at the younger ages. and it continues as they age, and we see there's an increase in population that's going to be in the greater to 65 area. The US is quite similar in terms of they're seeing large pockets of growth at the 65 and older. In fact, they're seeing even greater population increases at the 85 and older, but they have a growing population. They have a higher birth rate of the US overall, as well as they have higher levels of immigration. So this was one question that we were asked to look at, and this is us hopefully being responsive to the group at large. One question we were also handling was, let's talk about labor force participation rate. A lot of our information that we provided was related to Vermont and the labor force participation rates of individuals by age category, and said, well, what does the US look like? You know, we mentioned that Vermont has a higher labor force participation rate than the US overall, and this is the data to support it. Again, blue being the US and green being Vermont. In 2007, a difference between 70% in Vermont versus 66% in the US overall, about a 4 percentage point advantage. And we talked about the decline in the labor force, which you can see as you go from 2007 to 2014, both the US and Vermont have declined in labor force participation rate, and we still maintain that about 4 percentage point advantage in terms of higher labor force participation rate. During the last conversation, we talked about how we have a higher than average educational attainment level here, the citizens and population of Vermont, and higher levels of educational attainment translate to higher levels of labor force participation rate. At least that's the relationship that is historically seen and bears out here. And so when we talk about the age groups, when the story is quite similar. We highlighted the fact that older or mature workers are increasing their labor force participation rate, and that's found true both for the US and Vermont. The prime age earning years of 25 to 64, Vermont actually stayed stable, and in the US had a slight decrease over this 7-year period. So for Vermont, that's a strong sign indicating that people are staying in the labor force and staying engaged. And we also talked about how the youngest population, the 16 to 24-year-old group, has a declining rate of a labor force participation rate. In Vermont, it went from 62 to 61% versus the US, which actually had a sharper decline from 59 to 55. And this was one of those things that I think I took my Department of Labor hat off and said on a personal note, this is one of the things that kind of concerns me. We understand there is a relationship between education and labor force participation rate. We know younger people are staying in education institutes a little bit longer than historically, but this idea of postponing or delaying their first professional experience is something that concerns me as someone, because that professional experience at a young age, even if it is not your end all be all of careers, is still valuable professional experience which you gain. We all remember that first job you had and the people you were exposed to. I worked in a mailroom, I worked in a grocery store, and the people you'd meet and the experiences you gained were just truly valuable as far as like understanding how business worked, how teams work, how productivity is really accomplished, how goals are met.
How do you define that?
Labor force participation rate?
Full-time employer or a full-time position?
This is actually if it's
In that age group?
you're either looking for work or have work.
Right.
Yeah. So people are saying, I'm not looking for work. So younger people are more frequently are saying, no, I'm not looking for work. I'm busy doing other things, or I've got other opportunities that I'm taking, and I'm not pursuing work. So this is just, it's a combination of those employed as well as those unemployed, but it's the actual desire and willingness to accept work. So younger people are postponing that choice. So we talked about, we've just showed a 7-year stretch between 2007 and 2014 of a decline in the labor force participation rate, both at the US overall as well as in Vermont. This was a question that came to us from the last discussion. While we do not have exact Vermont data, we do have US data, courtesy of a study that was conducted for the Executive Office of the President of the United States related to the labor force participation rates in the U.S. economy, and 50% of this decline in the labor force is related to demographic factors, the aging of the population, the baby boomers moving through their work life, retiring, and realizing that they are at the end of their work life and have decided to enjoy the spoils of all their hard work. A small part of this is actually related to the massive recession that we just experienced, which we talked a little bit about last time. 16% associated with cyclical declines with the recession. And then about a third falls into this other factors component. And the other factors component could be related to either this the increased or heavily like new phenomenon, long-term unemployed. This is something that is beyond just the recessionary impacts. There's actually, when you look at the long-term unemployed data, there is just an elevated population of these individuals. And so that has something to do with the decline in the labor force, people becoming discouraged. And as we talked about a little bit, and we'll look at here, it's not so much an issue in Vermont regarding the discouraged worker population. And then these other demographic factors, which really relate, again, to younger people making choices or taking opportunities that do not involve seeking employment. And now I will turn it over to Kevin, and he's going to take you through another couple of questions, and then we will move forward.
So, do all of you remember the 2004 DNC when Obama gave a riveting speech? Really great speech, right? Does anyone remember who came after Obama in the 2000s? Now you know how I feel. I'm talking about the mix of part-time and full-time work, and the question we got was, how has employment changed over time, part-time, full-time, due to the recession? We don't have the data from the employment side. We have it from the household side, so respondents to the current population survey. And what we can see is that between 2007 and 2014, nationwide, the percent of people working full-time has increased basically from 16 to 18%, which means the population of the workforce that is working full-time has decreased by about 2%. And if you look at the data a little closer, you'll see that it is on the rebound. It actually dropped more than that during the heart of the recession, and it's coming back up a little bit. But so 2% larger portion of the workforce nationwide is working part-time. Unfortunately, the way our data is set up, we don't have historical data for Vermont on that topic. But what we do know is that compared to the rest of the country, Vermont has a much larger portion of its population whose primary employment is part-time. As you can see here, we said about 19% of the population in the country right now is working part-time. In Vermont, about 28% of the population is working part-time. That is second, just one second, that is second only to Maine, which has an even greater part-time population. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you disaggregate this by gender whenever you're doing these things.
We could do that. Can you make a
I
note
think it
of
would be
that?
helpful.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
also looking at poverty.
That's a great question. We will do that in time for the next follow-up. So yeah, good. And as you can see, in this case, full-time employment in Vermont is about 229,000, and the part-time workers, the green wedge there, is about 90,000, 90,100 to be exact, people working as their primary employment part-time in Vermont. And now we're going to look at what does that 28.2% wedge look like. Of that 28.2%, or of that 90,100 people, you can see the small wedge there, 14.5% of them, basically 15% of them, are working part-time for economic reasons, which means they're working part-time, but they would prefer to work full-time, but the business opportunity isn't there. Their employer can't offer them full-time work, and they can't find full-time work elsewhere. Those are, if we had to say which one is more concerning, we would say that the 15% who would like to work full-time but can't find full-time employment is a concern. The other 85% of people working part-time are working part-time for some other reason that's not related to the economic conditions. It might be because they're staying at home with their children. It might be because they just want to work part-time. Maybe they've retired and gone back to work a little bit, working on the side. So 77,000 people in Vermont are working part-time for non-economic reasons. In Vermont, there's only 13,100 working part-time for economic reasons. And that ratio of 85 to 15%, the 85% working part-time for non-economic reasons is much larger than the portion nationwide. Nationwide, this slide would show a 75% portion of the population working part-time for non-economic reasons, and a 25% portion of the population working part-time for economic reasons. This is in line with the fact that our labor market is generally in better shape than the rest of the country. At least that's what our data seems to indicate. When we look at the people who are working part-time, if you look here, you can see that there are currently in Vermont approximately 15,200 people who are the traditional definition of unemployed. These are people who are able to work, are willing to work, have looked for work in the past month, but are not working. So there's 15,200 of them. There are 3,300 what we call marginally attached workers, and these are people who would take work if it was offered, but are not currently looking. And of those 3,300, 1,000 of them are the discouraged workers, and those are people who would take work if it was offered, are not looking, but don't believe, have basically quit looking, and don't believe they can find work, and that is why they are a marginal worker. Does that make sense to people? So that's a subgroup of the marginally attached workers. And then what we talked about earlier, the involuntary part-time employed, on the last side it said 13,100, 13,200 on this one, just slightly different time frames we're looking at. But overall, that means in our office, we refer to this as the underutilized labor force. These are people who would like to work more and are not. Currently in Vermont, it's about 31,700 people. So that is data from the household survey, right? This is, people are called up and asked, would you like to work more? Those kind of questions. Now we're going to shift a little bit to the business data. The data I'm about to present here, that is very brief, comes from firms on a monthly basis. Somebody asked if we could remove Burlington from the statewide change in employment. This graph will look familiar, hopefully, with the addition of a new line. You can see, perhaps you'll remember that since the recession started, the jobs in Vermont started declining in June of 07. So we started in June of 07, and you can see that Burlington hit its bottom in June of 09 and has pretty much been growing ever since, and growing fairly substantially. The rest of this state, if you remove the Burlington nectar, which is basically Chittenden County with a couple small towns attached to it, if you remove Burlington from that, and this probably isn't a surprise to most people, the growth in employment, we are still below where we were in terms of total employment, below where we were in June of 07. The growth that we have had in total, which is the blue line, is due in large part to the growth we've seen in the Chittenden County area. And then we had one more question, which was somebody asked if there were, if employment changes or layoffs at large firms, this is my words, not the words that were asked, but are they masking job growth in small firms? So basically, are a couple large layoffs impacting it? And the only way I can answer that is to say that using the data we have from 2007 to the present, by industry, you can't find any single instances where a single firm was responsible for a change in employment greater than about 25% of the total employment in that industry. Does that? So there doesn't appear to be one or two large sets of layoffs that are driving this. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened. It means that using the data we have, we don't see it. So we can't really speak to it. And back to Matt.
Thank you, Kevin. And one thing I just want to point out as a thank you to the group, I can't remember who it was who pointed out this one. There was a question about this point right here in the Burlington data, and Kevin and I both have had this question come up several times, and finally we just said, okay, we're going to really get to the heart of this and find out what that was. And it turns out it was a keying entry error on our federal partners side. We sent them some data to load, and they moved a month, and So that will be corrected in March. So thank you to the group for bringing it up again. And finally, we just said, okay, we're going to figure this out. And we dug way deep and found out it was they switched a seasonal factor that caused this to occur. That there's basically looks like a ramp up in private education that occurred 1 month too early. As such, that is going to smooth out, and that spike will no longer be there. And we were glad to say it was at the federal side. It wasn't state level problems.
Tom Longsford from Resource. I'm just curious if what the, you may not know this, but what the population or perhaps the working age population graphs would look like over the same time frame for these same groups. I mean, I have a sense that they might follow, I mean, that non-Burlington areas are losing population and that Burlington is growing in population in that region. Is that correct?
Yeah, just restating, the question relates to changes in population around the state as it relates to changes in employment around the state. And we've certainly seen that there are certain counties that have been experiencing either flat or no growth or negative growth in population. Chittenden County has not been one of those. Chittenden County has been growing and it has been expanding. And I think it would fall similar to what the graph represents. So that's a good question.
Can you answer which is the chicken and which is the egg?
Let's see. If you saw Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come, is a theory that likes to be floated by economists related to, opportunities draw people towards it. At the same time, economic activity is created by population. So, traditional economic growth, I don't know if I went over this last time here, but traditional economic growth theory is, you increase your population is the first way to increase your economic output. You bring more people in. Even if they're using less than cutting edge tools, you'll still generate economic activity through that. So that's certainly a challenge in terms of Vermont's recent past. It's something that we can look towards, like changing immigration or encouraging retention. I think some of the things that Commissioner Goslin mentioned that ACCD is doing is trying to change that. So say, this population. I can't answer definitively the chicken or the egg, which came first. That is a good question. But population is historically thought of from an economic growth standpoint as a key determinant in economic output.
I mean, sorry to keep going,
No.
but I mean, it's somewhat important because we care. I mean, if people are leaving because there are no jobs, that's a sad situation we want to fix.
Mm-hmm.
If there's less people are moving for, they like the weather somewhere else or something like that, that may not be as big an issue from a policy perspective, trying to, how do we change this, right? Because we may not be able to control it anyway, but maybe it's people's quality of life is still good. And so.
Yeah, and for those on the phone, the question was related to population and economic output in terms of which is coming first. Is it that people are leaving because there aren't economic opportunities, or opportunities are, did I say that right? People are leaving because they aren't there, or people it's them leaving that's causing the decline in economic output. And it's got to be a combination of the two in some ways. It's not a perfect. As an economist, what we would look to is say that once the opportunities present themselves to change direction, so if that means that the housing prices in a certain area decline because people are leaving, then people move in and that creates economic activity. And so, the unfortunate theoretical answer as an economist that we're always taught through traditional economic thing is like, oh, the market will solve that problem. If people don't like that place, they'll leave until the price of it goes down such that people decide they like it enough, and then they come in, and then they revitalize it or whatever it might be. But it does become a kind of a reoccurring, a vicious cycle, if you want, versus a virtuous cycle, as in Burlington, where you have people going there, as it relates to economic opportunity or quality of life or access to amenities.
Can I just add
Yeah,
a little
please.
piece that it's a nationwide phenomenon as well, that people are moving out of rural areas after a trend the other direction for decades. People are moving out of rural areas into urban areas, and Burlington's an urban area. So there's going to be a flow of people, and once you reach a certain critical mass of employment, it creates that virtuous cycle that you want to see.
Yeah, that was a good point for the people on the phone, is that this is also as much a national trend in terms of the preference of individuals to live in urban centers, moving away from rural, and that trend has been going on the last few years.
Then going to the gross progress indicator, does that account for sort of population at all in the sense of, does that, I mean, if your economy is growing just because of population growth, but everything else is actually getting worse, I mean, does it factor that in?
That's a good question, and I would defer to Commissioner Goslin on the how the genuine progress indicator accounts for changes in population or changes in quality of life.
The short answer is it doesn't necessarily account for changes in population, although typically if you have a large population, you have a higher GDP, but you may not have better quality of life. The second part of that was, does it account for quality of life, and that is in terms of education, in terms of environmental impacts, and in terms of other measures.
And if you look at Vermont's population, the change in Vermont's population over time, we do go through these steps where we are very, very flat, and then all of a sudden we get a surge, and then we're very, very flat, and then we get a surge. And we're certainly well into a flat period, and whether or not, kind of as preferences change, whether it relates to preference for urban or rural lifestyle, or more of a less urban than New York City or LA, if there was a change in preference on a national scale away from an urban environment, it would take the slightest change to have a massive increase in population for a state like Vermont. And that's what's happened historically, is we will go flat and then we will get a big run up for over the span of about 10 years, where all of a sudden it just looks like we're going to go straight to the moon in terms of population, and then it'll level off. And then it does it again. So it'll be interesting to see. And this is all related to a very difficult variable to predict, which is the in-migration of people into the state. We can predict birth rates and death rates very well, but we can't figure out who's moving where and why and which groups it's going to be. We can look at history to see which groups have done that. The period between the 90s and the 2000s was a big period of population growth for the state of Vermont. Many 30-somethings came in. The period of the 2000s to 2010 was not. It was more of that flat. So again, it's this idea of taste and preference, and I think some of the discussion that ACCD and Commissioner Goslin and her staff are having relate to that, and making people aware of the opportunities and the quality of life that exist, and even changing that needle ever so slightly on a massive population scale as the U.S. would create a surge of people.
Matt, does the Burlington labor market still take part of Franklin County and Grand Isle County?
Yes. Yeah, it's actually, we're just redefining it. Historically, it's just been like St. Albans and south and north of, the uppermost part of Addison County and north. But now, actually, with redefinitions as of this new year, when we start publishing new data, it's going to include all the way up to Swanton. And again, this data, labor market areas are based on commuting patterns, where people live and where people work and where people shop. And so based on the new data, the federal government has looked at where people are living and where people are working, and they're seeing that the Burlington labor market area is growing. So this is something to keep in the back of your mind as you start hearing new data statistics about the Burlington area and how rapidly it's growing. Some of that is because the size is actually increasing. People's access to the region is increasing because of a definitional change. We're including things like Swanton now.
How far to the east does that go?
I don't think it leaves Chittenden County. I think it runs right along that border.
We're losing Buell's Gore.
Yes, yeah. Kevin points out we're losing Buell's Gore from the Burlington labor market area, which is a lovely place. So now we're moving on into occupational data. And these, when we talk about business data, and we talk about the business data that our division has, and the Economic and Labor Market Information Division, we have a census of employment, and we can look at industry data and where people work on an industry level. And then we have timely, more monthly data at the same level, again, where people work by industry. This conversation, we're not going to do a lot of conversation about industry. We're going to jump right into the occupational side. So understanding that we're kind of continuing the discussion of individuals, and individuals' economic opportunities are in the form of occupations as opposed to industries. At a later time, we can always look at, or another meeting, we can look at the industry composition of the state of Vermont and which industries have been growing and shrinking. But as I may have mentioned during the last conversation, we have a very diverse economy on an industry level. We have a good presence of manufacturing, a healthy leisure and hospitality, private education, hospitals and medical care, and probably a whole bunch I'm forgetting, but those are like the big ones that are coming to mind. Oh, professional and business and technical services. All these form a nice balance to our economy, which gives people a wide variety of employment opportunities and different places to work. So this conversation, for our conversation and the upcoming, we're going to talk about occupational data. Now, again, what we're going to talk about is our expertise, and this is not something you need to become an expert in, and it's just something we're trying to educate you to what's available. So how we look at the information. So if you have questions of like, well, can we see things like that? That's what we were trying to get out of this. Or how can we look at this differently? When we look at occupational data, there's about 800 occupations. These are all federally defined. They have a 6-digit code, very, very specific and very, very detailed. In the state of Vermont, we publish data on about 600 of them. The other 200, we either don't have them, like oil drillers, or they're too small to publish brain surgeons, for example. But what this does is it gives us valuable information on account of how many people have these jobs and how much they make. It can be a very powerful tool for people who are looking to plan out a career map for themselves or are in a negotiation standpoint with an employer about what they're being offered in terms of a pay or salary. And it also can be helpful in the reverse for an employer to understand what the going market for these skills are, not only in Vermont, but you could compare it again because there are these this data is produced with a consistent federal methodology, so you could actually say, well, what does someone get in Boston? What does someone get in San Francisco for these similar jobs? And you could actually compare on a apples-to-apples basis. And this is what just a snapshot of what it looks like. There's no information up here that is particularly of interest to our discussion other than examples of what occupations look like. First in the list is chief executives with a code of 11-1011. So almost like a binary number, but you can see how many of them have that number. There's 350 of them in the Vermont economy, and it gives you an average and a median, but it also gives you the distribution. So if you are someone who doesn't have a lot of experience in this particular, maybe it's your first go around at chief executive officer, maybe you're coming in at the 10th or 25th percentile, but it gives you an understanding of what the going rate for these is. The big caveat with this data is, especially if you're using it in a negotiation situation, is that wages are only one part of total compensation, and an employer's benefit package can truly influence, sway one way or the other. I've had a number of conversations with employers, and they say, do you provide benefits? Nope, we provide cash. That's what we do. And you expect a higher wage for that employer versus someone who says, nope, we give 100% health care, we give 100% child care, tuition reimbursement, dental, vision, whatever it is. Then you're understanding that you're probably going to come in on a different side of the wage scale than someone who's going to provide no benefits at all. That's just a caveat I like to say.
For entrepreneurs, like sole proprietors, they are chief executives, but they wouldn't call themselves that necessarily. So is there a specific occupational title for that?
Great question. So the question is related to like an entrepreneur and how would they be coded and where would they find themselves in this data, because they might be the chief executive officer for their company, CEO, and how would we code them? We're nerds, right? We're data geeks. We like to have fun. We have something that we're always on the watch out for, which is called title inflation. Very frequently, we will send out a survey and ask people who works for your firm. Oh, they got a CEO, they got CFO, and what do these people do? Oh, they're a local general store, and you're just like, oh goodness, I don't think that's exactly what they're doing. And so this occupational coding system is based to the duty and roles and responsibilities, and there's very clear guidelines and annual training that we're required to attend. And it's based on the duties. So a lot of people consider them CEOs, but to be a CEO, for example, you need to have an outside board of directors that you answer to. If you don't have an outside board of directors, technically you are not considered a CEO. You might be called the general manager, or if you were working alongside or doing the work, if you're like an entrepreneur, say I opened up an economic shop, I would be considered an economist, even though I'd be like the only person working in the firm. So it's based on the duties you provide and perform.
Just as a reference point,
yes.
What's the number of firms in the state at this point? Because, I mean, the 350 of chief executives, even with having an outside board, is a really small number given how many businesses we have.
Yes. So the question is, how many firms are there in the state of Vermont? And so this, the majority of our data is based on firms that are required to provide unemployment insurance. And so there is about 23,000 firms in the state of Vermont required by law to provide unemployment insurance. And throughout those 22,000 firms, there would only be 350 CEOs. But they could be a general manager, a general operating manager. There's other, criteria or categories which would capture it. And that's what makes it so detailed and so interesting. A classic example, related to the duties is supervisors. A lot of people like to consider them supervisors. If you look in like the trades, in construction, the supervisor, or even in the restaurant industry, I'm the supervisor. Really, but they're working right alongside with everyone. Maybe they're checking people's work. Maybe they're, the person they get the call in saying they're sick. But for Bureau of Labor Statistics definitional purposes, if you are not working, if you are working 4 days or more on administrative-only tasks, you can be considered a supervisor. If you are working more than 1 day a week, performing duties and tasks right alongside the people you're working with or overseeing, you're considered and categorized in the employment opportunity that you're doing. So it's that, and so what you'd expect is if you had those duties, you would expect to be out on the 75th or 90th percentile. You'd expect to be compensated, but the duties and skills that you're demonstrating are really in line with the occupation that you're overseeing and supervising in that regard. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is this occupational data broken down by gender?
No, occupational data is not broken down by gender. That is a good question, at least on the state level. I have seen national estimates where it is broken out by gender. Vermont is unique in that we do require by state law that our industry data is broken out by gender. So we have a very clear and accurate picture of the gender distribution by industry, but occupation we would divert to national data to look at and see what that gender divide is. And the gender data by industry can be a little unorthodox or misleading because you'll see high concentrations of female employment in certain industries, yet the distribution of wages does not follow the distribution of gender. For example, healthcare is one that comes to mind, high concentration of female employment, but the distribution of the wages through that industry tend to favor higher pay occupations which tend to be male dominated, for example, like surgeons or doctors. And that distribution is not held. Finance is another good one. If you look at financial industries, there can be a high concentration, relatively speaking, of female employment, but the wage distribution within that industry tends to be more clerical and administrative support are filled by women. According to national data, and then the people making the brokers and the financiers tend to be men, according to national data. So that's a good question. So when we look at occupational data, this is great. It's very helpful. It gives us a snapshot of where we're at, a year ago. We are just wrapping up right now 2014 occupational projections, or excuse me, occupations, this data. So we will be publishing it very soon, and we will see. My hunch is that we're going to start seeing the wage pressure because as our labor market has tightened, there's fewer workers available to work. We're starting to see that pressure starting to mount. And there was just an article on MSN today I saw that said that the U.S. economy is due for an increase in wages as it relates to pent-up demand for skilled employment, and that the competition for these employees is going to drive up wages. And so I'm wondering if 2014 is going to be the first data evidence that we have of it here in Vermont. But we will be publishing that data in about a month. So this is historic. What if we want to know the future? We partner with the Employment and Training Administration, and they provide us a national model where economists out of DC make a forecast of what the national economy is going to do. They provide us the model so that we can tailor and cater it to Vermont-specific economic factors, and then we do a forecast for ourselves related to the economy here. And we do every year a 2-year forecast, which is a short term, or every 2 years we do a long year, 10-year. And that's probably one of our most popular data products. A lot of education institutes can't wait to get their hands on the long-term 10-year forecast, because this is the information that really arms them with being able to go out and speak to young people about where the employment opportunities of the future are going to be, as well as the educational requirements necessary to fulfill this. And this will be the discussion of our, the focus of our discussion going forward. And I should check time. Oh, great. Yeah, plenty of time. So these, this is a classic do not do in a presentation. Do not put up a massive graph with lots of data and expect people to be able to read it. Again, this is what we are trying to tell you, is inform you, is that this data is available. This isn't the time or place for all of us to be looking at 600 different occupations which are forecasted in the future. We are going to provide, as part of this, the exit packet of this information, we're going to have Michelle email to all the board members the lengthy, full snapshot. This is just for discussion purposes here, and allows us to just talk about the data that's available and how we can potentially use it. So when you're looking at occupational data, the Bureau of Labor Statistics sets the educational level, minimum educational level necessary to apply or be qualified for entry-level application to that job. So what we've done here is just as a sample is we've looked at all the occupations and we've grouped them by the educational attainment level to say, okay, what do they look like? And one of the consistent things that Commissioner Goslin's already pointed out is as the educational attainment level goes up, this one being less than high school, as the educational attainment level goes up, you'll see wages go up. So less than high school has access to a tremendous amount of employment opportunities at the lower end of the wage scale. This group, our projections data is not only broken out by educational attainment level necessary to have access to that job, but we also look at the employment and the growth. So we have the historical employment, what we expect growth will be, and we also look at annual openings. And annual openings can be one of two flavors. One, due to growth. If the industry is growing and we need more nurses, that could be it. Or annual openings due to retirements or job churn. So if a lot of nurses are retiring, or what we're seeing in the trades or in healthcare or in manufacturing is what we're being reported out, is there's a lot of mature workers who are getting ready to retire, and that is part of these projections. It looks not only at where growth may be, but where openings will be due to churn and retirement. When you look at, say, food service employment opportunities, there's a heavy amount of churn in those. It's not that there could be a small amount of growth, but a lot of annual openings due to churn as people migrate between different employment opportunities.
Yeah.
Yes?
Which form or in what way do you collect the openings?
The openings is based on U.S. Census data, and we look at individuals, and this is in partnership with our federal partners. They look at the age profiles and characteristics of the individuals in the jobs as they exist today, as well as measures of churn. So not just retirements, but also how many people either move on, what the average tenure in a particular place is. So it is a statistical model based on our population's profile.
So is that done then as every 10 years when the census is updated, or is that something that's a sample size that's done annually, or?
With the long terms, we'll do it every 2 years. We'll look at the underlying determinants, and we'll look at the profile and see if the, for example, like the age mix within healthcare has changed significantly. The U.S. Census gets a tremendous amount of data through the current population survey, and so it's based on a statistical sample that is modeled to represent the economy. So that's a good question. So less than high school, and this is how we can start looking at the data. Who has, these are organized by where the most number of annual openings will be versus the growth rate. And to give you a relative scale, the overall occupational growth rate is 0.8%. So if you are at 0.8%, this person right here, secretaries, administrative assistants, that's going to grow consistent with all occupational employments. It's not going to be relatively more or fewer. Anyone above 0.8% is going to be increase as a relative share of the economy, just considering where they are currently. So carpenters is topping the list, and one of the reasons is because the 2012 employment is still depressed from the recession, and that a lot of tradespeople are reporting that they haven't fully recovered from this recession. We talked a little bit about that last time. So anything like this 0.6, customer service representatives, that 0.6 has got a lower than average growth rate, and a lot of that you can see is where technology will start influencing outcomes. So a lot of customer service opportunities are being automated. They're finding ways to use technology to streamline that process, and it bears out in where we're forecasting occupational opportunities. So we've put together some different slides, and again, we're going to provide all this in a way that you can look at it critically and come prepared for a full discussion next time about these things. But just wanted to give you a sample of what the data is that's out there and available. So associate's degrees, a lot of discussion with this panel as we go forward. We'll have this information if we want to reference it, but you'll see as the education attainment increases, so does the wage, and a lot of the growth rates are going to start going up too. So you're going to start seeing tremendous growth rates, because where growth is going to occur is typically in the higher educations. So you're seeing like 2% growth rates down here in some of these ones. This is for bachelor's degrees. So again, I know this is a lot to handle, because again, it's tough to synthesize 600 occupations into a usable format. What I want to do, just to close this out and just talk about why this makes it so difficult. And again, this is where the intelligence and information and expertise that you all have in this room is so important to this conversation, because otherwise it's just data people looking at data and trying to understand human activity. And human activity is difficult to understand, especially if you're looking for a numerical basis for why decisions are made. I'm sure elected officials can understand that as well. So here's an example of some of what research has said, and said, okay, look, this is the National Skills Coalition. They said, here's what Vermont looks like in 2012. They have a definition. I actually have a call into them to get their actual definition. The definition that they used in this write-up was not sufficient for me to be able to replicate this data, and so I have questions about where their data comes from, and so I'm going to find out how they define these things. But low-skill jobs, they're saying, is 16%, about half being middle skill, and then this high skill. And as you roll it forward, here's their projection of how it's going to happen. I'll back and forward. They're saying there's going to be actually an increase in lower skill jobs, still a large population of middle skill jobs, and then the high skill jobs will contract somewhat. Now, this is, again, we're talking about research. I haven't been able to verify. I don't know how they came up with this, but it is interesting that they are able to put this thing forward, and I think it illustrates some of the difficulties we have when we're talking about these things. We have terms we're not really sure what they are, but they are able to quantify and look at, say, for example, high-skilled jobs. Here is the number of jobs, and this is the supply of people. These are the workers, supply versus demand. So they're saying, oh, there's more people qualified for high-skilled jobs than there are available. And conversely, the middle-skilled jobs, there's actually a shortage of people who are going to be ready to produce at that level, fill those occupational needs. And what I don't like about the terms high and low and skilled is because it doesn't really pertain to an educational attainment level, because there are certain skills that are going to be captured in this middle skill, which are going to be high-paying, very rewarding jobs and very rewarding employment opportunities. And what we have here is you can see that the economy is going to find some way to balance out, and this is going to be increased competition for these, and this is going to take me into the conclusions. But first, Hugh, do you have a question?
Yes, Michelle and I were down there this week.
Yes.
They defined high skill workers as 4 years, 4 year degree or above. Middle skill could be an associate's degree or above, short of 4 year bachelor's or whatever. And then low skill would be high school GED. So they did define it by educational levels, and they used those definitions.
Yeah, and the write-up is about as succinct as that, related to that. And what the problem is when I look at our occupational projections, I can't get them to line up. I can't get this 35% to match up. We've come up with a quasi middle skill, but we can't get this low to high. And that's why I'm wondering, because they cite the source of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which in theory is us. So, I'm trying to learn a little bit more about how they threw some over the fence and how they didn't, because that's, it seems as clear as day when you read it. You're like, oh yeah, 4 years and above is high, and then, less than high school is low, and then everyone in the middle, but we couldn't match it. So why, and this is the conclusion, this is unfortunately not much of a punchline, but at least it's going to hopefully stimulate discussion. Why is this so difficult? Because skills are transferable and generic. We have access to data through what's called ONET, which studies all the occupational codings that I mentioned, all 800 occupations, and it tracks the skills necessary to be successful in those jobs. We tracked 200 jobs that needed an associate's degree, and the most important thing was critical thinking. So, okay, well, they need critical thinking. an associate's degree is the only thing that's giving us any sort of leverage to understand what that job has, because I can name a number of occupations that require a high school degree or a PhD, and all of them need critical thinking. You know, the classic failure of saying that math is important for a job. Well, whether you're rocket science or a cashier, you need some level of math, and that level is in between. And so this is what some of the challenges, and this is why leading off the discussion with Commissioner Goslin and what Frank and Michelle were talking about, the intelligence from the business community and this group that's present, what does this really mean? What do we really need? How do we meet people halfway to get them the skills they need to be readily employable, to have that productivity that's going to help a Vermont business be successful? The other reasons this is so difficult is the economy is ever evolving. When I go out and talk to young people, I say, you're going to have jobs that don't even exist right now. I can't even produce data for the jobs you're going to have in the future because they don't exist yet. And so when I talk to people about the economy or about occupational projections, I say, don't get married to the title. Think about it as a skill set. So when you think of a data administrator or a database administrator or a marketing analyst, don't think about it as a specific title. Think about it as a basket of skills that are going to be necessary to be competitive in an evolving economy. And these are signals saying which skills are going to be of value, and the wage rates will also be a signal of the skills or what are going to be of value. Requirements are ever changing. Nurses on the national level are still listed as an AA, as requiring an AA. Here in Vermont, that's not the case. We require a BA. And there's a big migration towards that right now. And people change their minds. And this is going to be the last thing I'll point out regarding some research that was done by Georgetown, and why this topic is so difficult is that you can see Bureau of Labor Statistics will put out a survey that says 40% of all jobs of the future require some level of post-secondary education. You look at a Georgetown study that says the exact opposite. 60% of all jobs of the future are going to require some level of post-secondary education. And it's the definitions which are the challenge. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, as I mentioned, uses a definition that says this is the education you'll need to gain access to entry-level employment, to be able to be qualified just to apply. It doesn't mean you're going to be competitive. It doesn't mean you're going to be able to get that job 9 times out of 10. But this is the baseline education that you need for this employment. Georgetown actually did research not so much on the educational needs of the employment, but on the educational attainment level of the people who have that job. So if you are a PhD cab driver, check, we need 1 PhD. And it's this idea of that this is a competitive market. If you want the jobs you want, you're going to have to compete, which goes back to this slide when we look at if you want the jobs you want, whether it needs a high school degree or not, having some college or having a post-secondary certificate is going to make you all the more competitive. And so the big takeaway, and what I try to encourage us to think about, is how we can take the increment, look at the incremental change. For those people that were not going to complete high school, how do we get them to the high school degree? For the people who are at high school, how do we get them in a post-secondary education training opportunity? How can we move them up just ever so slightly so that they're being better prepared for a competitive employment environment?
We'll just offer, maybe we can keep that slide up there for the next panel, because one of the things I'm hoping, I'm Dan Smith from Vermont Tech, if you look at that slide, one of the things we have is a culture that prioritizes a 4-year degree as opposed to a 2-year associate's or a technical degree. In reality, that's an inefficiency in terms of people's purchase of education in a post-secondary level. You're more likely to be economically successful in a middle-skilled job with an associate's degree, given the openings that are there, than you are to get than to be economically successful if you have a 4-year degree going to a high-skilled job with fewer openings. And so I hope that's something that we all take out into the public forum and remind people of the economic value of a 2-year technical degree.
Agreed. Training to employment opportunities as needed, as opposed to the potentially over-credentialed, so to speak, or taking coursework which really isn't material to the overall goals of the individual.
Just wondering, when you send us that spreadsheet or whatever format it's going to come in of 600 or 800 occupations, could you do a sort by the annual growth rate? Because you said the background data is or growth is 0.8. So I think it'd be really interesting for us to see what's above 0.8, and then as you guys are as we're looking at the programs and where all the federal dollars are going for the types of programs that we're funding, to correlate those against where we're actually putting our money for the types of programs that we're supporting.
Yeah, the request is for the data to come in a usable format such that we can look at the percent growth. I think it's important we provide that as well as the one based on annual openings, because otherwise you'll be, digital sonographers, digital medical sonographers are growing at a tremendous rate, but it's going, from 80 to 90.
Yeah.
And we need to look at where the openings are for employment opportunities for individuals. Question?
Representative Kristen Plano, I was just going to piggyback on that and say that some of the growth rates were very small. And so I didn't see if there was a percentage of total openings, but that would be a way of benchmarking. So high growth rate in a very small sector.
Yep.
Versus low growth rates in very large sectors, or where that matches up.
Yeah, we'd be happy to provide the data in whatever way is most useful. We'll take our best first stab at it, and we're going to break it out. We think it's important to break out by educational attainment level, at least for a start of a conversation, so that you know kind of what basket you're looking at. But that is certainly a good thing. So I think right now we're up on a short break.
We're going to take a really short break. We want everybody to get